On a day as historic as it has been volatile, the American embassy moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that ceremony attended by dozens of Israeli and American officials. And alongside it, across the West Bank and Gaza, clashes and deadly protests. The Gaza Health Ministry reporting 55 people have been killed there. The White House press briefing underway now. They were asked about it. They say responsibility for the deaths and violence rests squarely on Hamas.
Well, let's go now live to our Washington studios. Joining us there is the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, now a distinguished fellow in international diplomacy in Brookings Institute. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. Let me just ask you, we have some breaking news. South Africa's government announcing that it is going to withdraw its ambassador from Israel as a response to the events today in the Gaza Strip. Going ahead, what kind of response do you expect to see from the international community to the events today, both in Jerusalem and at Gaza?
Well, I think we're going to see it's mixed. There will be some, like South Africa, I'm sure Turkey, Iran, will condemn Israel and make it clear that in various ways that they consider Israel as responsible for the violence and the high death toll. On the other side, as we already heard from the White House, there'll be a defense of Israel and blaming of Hamas. And in between will be the Europeans who will say Israel has a right to defend itself, but should exercise proportionate force in response, and will probably criticize Israel for what looks to be a disproportionate response when over 50 Palestinian youths are killed.
Martin, about this move today, about the decision to move the embassy, you had tweeted earlier that this didn't have to be a zero-sum game, I assume, meaning that this did not have to be a complete win for Israel and a complete loss for the Palestinians. How do you think this should have been done differently?
Well, it just required one sentence in President Trump's rollout, or one sentence in Jared Kushner's remarks today. After all, he's the peace envoy, which should simply say that we also recognize that the Palestinians aspire to have their capital in East Jerusalem. That doesn't really amount to very much, except a sensitivity towards the fact that Palestinians also see and want Jerusalem as their capital. And you know, if you're going to play the role of a broker in the peace process, you have to show that you're aware of both sides' needs. And by ignoring them completely, and for President Trump to say straight out, I've taken Jerusalem off the table, which means to Palestinian ears that there's nothing for them in Jerusalem, that he's already resolved it in Israel's favor, that's something that they can never accept. A Palestinian state that doesn't have East Jerusalem as its capital is something that I don't think the Palestinians are going to go for at all. And certainly Abu Mazen isn't going to accept that. So the net effect is to drive the Palestinians away from the table. I think that some of them were quite happy because they didn't like what Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt were cooking anyway, so this gives them the excuse. It also gives the Arab states who were willing to engage in the peace process an excuse for them to stand back, as they are now doing, and saying, well, we can't do anything to help you anymore because of what you've done on Jerusalem. So I think while it's a great day for Israel in terms of recognizing Jerusalem as its capital, it's a bad day for the peace process.
Martin, I have to ask you, you were the ambassador during the 1990s when that Jerusalem Relocation Act was passed. Was it a mistake not to move the embassy at that time under the terms you described, or was that something what you discussed with President Clinton at the time?
Oh, yes, we had many discussions about it because if you remember back to those days, we did have an active peace process. We were moving towards a final status negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And President Clinton said, you know, once this issue is resolved in final status negotiations, which we expected would be during his term in office, then we'll move the embassy. And as ambassador to Israel, I put together a small team in the embassy to figure out how we would do it with the expectation that as soon as we got an agreement, we would move the embassy the next day. That is to say, me as the ambassador with the flag would go up to Jerusalem and plant it somewhere as a demonstration, particularly to Israelis, that the United States recognized Jewish Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So the context was very different. We had an active peace process, an expectation that final status negotiations would lead to a resolution on Jerusalem, and that in that context we would move the embassy immediately.
Martin, in just about the minute we have left, the Trump administration is calling this a way forward to peace. They say this will help pave the road to peace. Do you see it that way at all? Can you imagine that scenario?
No, as I said already, it's just happy talk. This notion that, oh, well, we just recognize reality and therefore now everybody will come back to the table is frankly ludicrous. I don't think anybody can believe that when you look at those split-screen images of Israelis and Americans celebrating in Jerusalem and Palestinians dying on the border with Gaza. And, you know, it's just going to get worse, I'm afraid, before it gets any better. Tomorrow is Nakba Day. With such a high casualty toll, the potential for escalation is very high.
Right.
We've seen this movie before, and it ends badly. It doesn't end in peace.
All right. Former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, great to have you with us.